Hey everybody, welcome to Truth Be Told. Thank you very much for listening in. I really appreciate your time. We have got a great question today. Should Christians cuss? I love this question, love this discussion, love this conversation because I think when we think critically about this, it's more challenging than you might expect on the surface. I probably will not answer this question as hard-lined as many of you would think that I should. Maybe some people think absolutely they should or could or can. Maybe some of you think absolutely they never should, could, or can. I'm not really going to be answering one way or another, but I do think that this is a more nuanced conversation than many people think that it is up front. I know most Christians would probably be like, cuss words are bad and wrong. The Bible explicitly talks against them, and so we shouldn't use them. This is not me defending the use of certain language as actively good, but I do hope to take a closer look at the topic of cuss words in general, and hopefully by the end of this, think a little less superficially about these words from a biblical context especially. If we can do that, this will be a successful episode because I think we often do think very superficially, like this word is wrong, this word is right, and I don't know that that's what the Bible is outlining. So first, before we kind of get into this, I want to make a few statements that just kind of bother me about this whole conversation. I think we need to stop calling them curse words or swear words, especially in a biblical context, because those are, in my opinion, really outdated terms. And honestly, historically, they've been called that, like these terms curses or swear words have been applied to some of these, words that we all know, but I'm not going to say out loud on the internet. They've been applied to those words so that we kind of think of them as taboo, or especially spiritually taboo. Certain words like damn or hell, sorry if that offended anybody, those words have in the past been used to pronounce evil judgment on somebody with your words. So I can see how that would fall under this heading of maybe it used to be a curse or a swear or something like that. But when we're talking about morality, especially biblical morality, dropping the F-bomb is not the same thing as taking an oath or swearing. And there is a word for that in the Bible. Dropping an F-bomb is not the same as working within the spiritual realm to proclaim harm on a person or a curse. It's not that. It is a word that we might be uncomfortable with. It might be a word that offends people, but it's not a swear. It's not an oath, and it's not a curse. So I don't like those words. Personally, even though the word cuss comes from the word curse, I still like it better when referring to some of these terms because it's taken on its own connotations. No one hears the word cuss and thinks I'm pronouncing a magical curse upon you or something like that. And so that's the word I'm going to use when we talk about, some of these words that I'm going to try my best not to say out loud. Full disclosure, I do sometimes say cuss words, and I don't really feel all that bad about it. There are times I use them and do feel bad about it, but not every time I use a word that's considered a cuss word do I think of it as a morally evil or reprehensible thing. We'll get into that in just a minute. Second, God does tell us in Scripture to refrain from certain types of speech, namely coarse jesting, empty speech, filthy speech, things like this. The verses we could go to are Ephesians 5, verse 4, which says, "Let there be no filthiness, nor foolish talk, nor crude joking, which are out of place, but instead let there be thanksgiving." I want to note that it does give you an alternative thing that should be filling your speech. Colossians 3, verses 8 to 10 says, "But now you must put them all away, anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices, and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator." And likewise in this verse, a few verses later, it talks about what that new self looks like. It says it's compassionate, kind, humble, meek, patient, forgiving, loving, peaceful, and harmonious. Now, I realize that we look at these verses as explicit polemics against cuss words. And in a way, I agree with you, and in a way, I disagree with you. Because it's important to note that so much more than just filthy speech is mentioned that we know is not good, but don't take nearly as seriously. Filthy speech being the thing that most people would say is attributed to cuss words, things like that. But what about empty speech? What about angry words? What about slander against others or lies? We could say these are bad things, but we're not as scandalized by them. If someone speaks out in anger, we're not quite as scandalized than if they say certain words that seem to trigger certain reactions from us. And so I do want to say that these verses do talk about being careful with our speech, but I don't know that we're exactly reading the entire verse. Instead, we just use them to say, see, you shouldn't say the F word or the S word or the A word, whichever word starts with whatever letter you want to use. We shouldn't say those things, but really it's talking about all kinds of different speech to avoid. So I don't want us to pigeonhole it to say it's just saying don't use these certain words. Especially because how often are our words, our speech, our language absent the things it tells us to be full of? Even if we're not using cuss words, how often can we say that our words are actively compassionate, kind, humble, meek, patient, forgiving, loving, peaceful, harmonious? Sometimes we just speak. And I don't know that we're doing the active part of these commands. We'll get into that in just a minute, though. Ephesians 4:29 also states, let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but instead only that which edifies or builds up. So in all of these verses, it's not just don't do this, it's saying fill your speech with this. So there's an active portion of these verses. The opposite of filthy language, then, is edifying language, not just no cuss words, right? That's the point I'm trying to make here. Often I think we believe we're fulfilling commands by abstaining from what we believe the command to be about, but so often the Bible tells us what our active part must be, which often informs or should inform or tell us about the heart of the verse in question. And so often we ignore the active part, which actually gives us an indicator about what the negative part means or intends to be speaking about. The purpose of our speech is to build relationships, to build others up, and to reflect God. In all of these verses, that is very consistent. Now, I also realize many people are probably hearing this so far and thinking, okay, yeah, there's plenty that I could do better with my speech, but Micah, you're really far away from convincing me that I'm not at least halfway there by removing cuss words from my vocabulary. All right, that's all good. If that's the place you're at, if all I've gotten you to do is think a little more critically on those verses and realize that they don't just say, don't say cuss words, they say, put on good speech, which looks like these things, that's great. But again, this whole episode is not meant to convince you that cuss words are good. I don't want you to go from a place of feeling like I should not say cuss words to then saying, oh, I should be saying them all the time. No, that's not the purpose of this. It's to get us to think critically about what the Bible actually says and how we interpret it, to think a little less superficially about this topic of speech and cuss words. Now, what I will say, however, is that none of these verses, and none of the ones we even could go to regarding speech, are explicitly outlawing the S word, the F word, the A word, or any other letter of word that we can think of. It is not saying thou shalt not say this syllable or this phrase. It's not saying that. This might seem like semantics. This portion of the argument is kind of where I end up losing people in this because it feels like semantics, but the Bible is written in Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic, and no one speaking those languages would have the foggiest idea of what you were meaning if you just walked up to them and dropped a cuss word in American English and then walked away out of the blue. They wouldn't know. If you walked up to Paul and just said, damn it, he would have no clue what you're saying because the language wouldn't translate. He spoke Greek, and he was very familiar with Hebrew as well. But the English word, damn it, would not mean anything to him. And so it's not the word itself. It's not the letters in that combination. It's not the syllables. It's not as your lips form around the pocket of air that you're pushing out as your vocal cords vibrate and your tongue is shaping the word into a certain thing, and that's somehow more evil than if you were to say puppies. It's not that. I think we need to at least agree on that it's not the physical letters or sound you're making that is being talked about in some of these verses about pure speech. And the reason I say this is because it should cause us to ask, okay then, what is obscene And why is it obscene? As far as what these people are talking about in Scripture, Paul, Jesus, James, Peter, any of the people, any of the biblical authors who spoke about language and good speech could not have meant a certain set of syllables, physical syllables, are more profane or less profane than other ones. That's not what is being talked about here. We inherently actually know this. We know that words are very highly cultural. Years ago, the word bonfire would be hated by the Christian community because it goes back to the words bonefire, which is a pagan practice. So if anytime you said, hey, let's have a bonfire, they'd think you're inviting them to a pagan ritual. They'd be like, absolutely not. You're a heathen. You're evil. You're awful. Don't say those words. Don't even invoke them in my presence. It would be very, very offensive, but it's not today. Years ago, the word nice meant whorish or a loose woman. It does not mean that today. All of us say the word nice and think it's a positive thing. It's not only switched from like very negative to neutral, it's switched from very negative to very positive. It's a compliment to give someone. Years ago, the word damn was the most offensive cuss word in the Christian community, while words like the F word were relatively in common use, even within the religious community. It wasn't like a religious word, but it wasn't offensive in society at that time. Our attitudes towards these words have all changed within American English, which is a relatively new language as far as languages go. Nice is not an obscene word because culturally it does not mean something obscene anymore. I probably couldn't even convince you to stop using the word nice. It sounds ridiculous to you to be like, well, I'm not going to play by the rules of, this ancient American society that believed nice was a bad word, because that's not how I mean it anymore. So even if you know the origins, you know that that word now means something totally different, and you're not going to stop using it. However, if someone from back in that time, when the word nice meant something like whorish or a loose woman, came back to life today, and you said the word nice in front of them, and they acted all scandalized, just horrified that you would use a word like that. They gasped for air and were about to faint. You would probably apologize. You might not know at first what you're apologizing for, but once you know that you've offended them, you probably would apologize to them because your intent was not to offend. Your intent was not to use a filthy word, but that's how they received it. I think this shows that the thing that is obscene behind a certain set of syllables is the idea that the word is communicating and the perception or the reception of the person who receives that communication. This is the thing that's obscene, not the syllables, not the physical word itself, the idea behind the word and how it's received by the person it's being communicated to. In America, like in any other culture, certain words have become taboo, but this changes over time, and we are all susceptible to that. We're all living proof of that. So cuss words are just words that we currently socially agree are off color and generally offensive. But there will not always be agreement on what is offensive and what is not, especially as generations progress and there's a transfer from one generation to the next and times change and people change. The words and language changes, and so what is offensive is also going to change. Cultural norms change, which in effect changes how we view speech. So did Paul mean in all these verses we quoted before, don't use the F word? Not specifically. He did not mean that. But you know that word can be offensive to a large majority of people because that's the culture we live in. So you do need to be careful about what you say, about what words you use, and to who you use them to. Because Paul also talks a lot about not needlessly causing others offense just because you believe something to be acceptable behavior. That's not okay. Even if it's right and okay for you to do, it doesn't mean you need to avail yourself of that right when it bothers somebody else. Now, if it's good to do and someone's bothered, that's a little bit different. We can have a separate discussion about that. But if it's just like, well, I think it's fine, so I'm just going to use it wherever and whenever I want. No, that's not appropriate and not acceptable. That is a heart issue that you're just trying to needlessly offend people, and you're not considering someone who might be bothered by something. And it's not wrong for them to be bothered by it culturally. That's okay. So we still need to be careful about what we say. But interestingly, it's Paul, one of the biggest proponents of clean language, who often gets interpreted as saying don't use cuss words, that actually uses a word that culturally would have been very, very crass to his readers. And he does it, which I think is even more funny, in Philippians chapter 3, which is one of the most encouraging books ever. In Philippians 3:8, he says he counts all things that he has gained in his past skibalon in comparison to Christ. That word skibalon, often translated in some translations as rubbish or refuse. And this word does mean refuse, trash, or dung, but it's something more heinous than those things. Those English words don't really get across the connotation that Paul was using. This is something disgusting, filthy. Essentially, Paul is saying, I count these things as, pardon my French, shit. That's what I count them as. I hate to be so bold about using that word. I said I wasn't going to use cuss words, and I'm really trying to, thread this needle very carefully because I'm not trying to offend people. But this is a better connotation of what Paul is saying here, and I want to be honest about that. This word was something that was a shocking degree of certain lesser words, which ultimately is what cuss words are, right? And we know that he's using a harsh degree because he already said that these things are something bad. He said he counts them as loss. The word there is zemian, but he steps it up in the next sentence. He says he counts them as nothing. He counts them as detriment. He counts them as excrement. He's building and building and building, really trying to show that everything in comparison to Christ is worthless. In Greek, he could have used the word kopria, which means manure. We find that in Luke 13, verse 8. In Greek, he could have used the word riparion, which means moral filth, James 1, verse 21. In Greek, he could have used the word sesepin, which means rotten or rotted, found in James 5, verse 2. Lots of words Paul could use to communicate something filthy or unclean, but he actively chose a word that is a bit extreme because he is communicating something extreme. The same way that when a child has a full diaper, you might say they've poopied, right? Or they've got poopy because it feels lighter. It feels more playful. You're not going to go tell a child like you crapped yourself. You're not going to say that. You're going to say poopy because it feels lighter. But no adults go around saying I have to poopy. They're not saying that because the context we're in calls for a different degree of the word that's a little bit more fact-based or a little bit more formal. If you somehow fell into a pile of cow poop, might it be appropriate to say that you're covered in, the word that comes to mind there? The word is shocking, but it also actively communicates a level of severity that the experience itself might call for in accurately communicating what is going on. All right, we got to wrap this up. That is pretty much my spiel, but words themselves, physical syllables and sounds are not in and of themselves evil. Intent is evil. When someone is offended or scandalized, whether for good reason or not, I think we need to do something to make that situation right. We do need to be careful about our speech because everything that comes out of our mouths will be held to account one day. Are we using our speech to lift up others, to communicate effectively and truthfully, to reflect God? Or did we use our language to offend, to shock just for the sake of shocking, or to tear people down? Personally, if someone said to me, Micah, I hate your guts and I hope you die, I'd be much more offended than if someone said, damn, Micah, it's good to see you. I don't really care that one of these sentences has a cuss word in it and one of them doesn't. The heart that is reflected in each is clear, and I believe one of these sentences much more accurately represents filthy speech, and the other, at least to me, in spite of the cuss word, does not.